What's the number one predictor to child abuse and infanticide? It's when a child lives with at least one step-parent. This phenomenon is called the Cinderella effect. So yes, that cliche about step-parents being evil, like in the story Cinderella, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, and numerous others, is a real-life phenomenon and not just a fairy tale. The Cinderella effect was first discovered by forensic psychiatrist Dr. P.D. Scott in 1973 after doing a research study on infants that had been fatally battered. Dr. Scott found that 15 out of 29, which is over 50% of the infants studied, were killed by the child's stepfather. But it took evolutionary psychologists Martin Dolly and Margot Wilson over 30 years of collecting and analyzing data from various sources, such as from official reports of child abuse, from clinical data, from victim reports, and from official homicide data, to see if the Cinderella effect had validity. Collecting data was important, but ultimately it was their evolutionary approach that allowed Dolly and Wilson to ask the appropriate questions to find out why stepchildren were at a higher risk of child abuse and infanticide. I'll elaborate on the evolutionary theoretical approach in a bit, but for now, Dolly and Wilson's studies concluded that stepchildren from several countries had a higher incidence of maltreatment, specifically when these maltreatments included lethal beatings. In several countries, step-parents beat young children to death at per capita rates that are more than 100 times higher than the corresponding rates for genetic parents. But what's the evolutionary explanation for the Cinderella effect? Dolly and Wilson proposed that the Cinderella effect is a direct consequence of the evolutionary theory of inclusive fitness, especially parental investment theory. I won't get into a lot of details explaining these evolutionary concepts because these concepts can get a bit complex for the purposes of this video. But the general idea is that since parental investment, the amount of time and effort that is invested in an offspring, is extremely costly, psychological mechanisms evolved in the evolutionary past by way of natural selection so that parents can discriminate in favor of their biological children and against non-biological children. Discriminating in favor of a child simply means that a biological parent will spend more time and effort in caring for their biological children over non-biological children. Discriminating against a non-biological child can range from simple acts such as spending less time with the child or spending fewer resources to extreme and rare behaviors such as beating a non-biological child to death. Such discriminatory behaviors have and do increase the number of offspring that will survive in a parent's lifetime when compared to parents that invest in a child indiscriminately. To put it bluntly, from a biological standpoint, a stepchild is a resource drain, a vehicle that is using up resources with no reproductive or genetic payoff. I know this sounds cruel, especially in modern societies where resources like food are no longer scarce, but resources in our evolutionary past were. But this psychological imprint of discriminating in favor of genetic offspring and against non-genetic offspring isn't unique to humans. A popular example that illustrates this behavioral imprint perfectly can be seen when a dominant male lion dies and a new rival enters the pride. The new male lion will begin to seek out and systematically kill the young of its predecessors. This act serves several purposes. It brings females into estrus, which can now become pregnant and have the new male lion's offspring. A similar behavior can be seen in other species such as in vervet monkeys, in langur monkeys, in mountain gorillas, and in many more species. It's easy to see why this behavior of favoring biological offspring over non-biological offspring was favored by natural selection. It simply has paid off genetically. Individuals that devoted more time, resources, and care to their biological offspring have had a higher reproductive payoff than individuals that didn't. However, it's crucial to understand that just because this behavior is natural, it doesn't mean that it's morally justified. Most step-parents don't abuse their stepchildren and are great caretakers. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that the Cinderella effect does exist, and being aware of this phenomenon can hopefully bring upon preventative measures to protect children that are at risk of child abuse. Although the scientific consensus does support the Cinderella effect, some individuals have argued that other contributing factors, such as poverty or socioeconomic status, could be a more powerful predictor for child abuse and infanticide. However, in one of the biggest studies ever done, Dolly and Wilson found that stepchildren are 40 times more likely to be abused physically than children living with both of their biological parents, and this risk exists even when poverty and socioeconomic status were controlled for. A higher rate of child abuse in low-income families does exist, but the rates in step families are approximately the same across different levels of socioeconomic status. Ultimately, step-parenthood per se remains the single most powerful risk factor for child abuse that has yet been identified. To take things a little further, in a paper written by Dr. Viviana Weeks Shackelford and Todd Shackelford called Methods of Filicide, Step-Parents and Genetic Parents Killed Differently, the researchers found that when a step-parent kills their stepchild, they generally use an overkill method showing their dislike towards the child. In other words, they do more than what is necessary to kill the child, such as by stabbing the stepchild 100 times or bludgeoning the child to death. Conversely, when a genetic parent kills their offspring, they tend to do it by using a quicker method, such as a gunshot to the head or a single stab wound to the heart, a method that produces a quicker and painless death. According to Dr. Shackelford, the methodology used to kill a child doesn't prove anything, but it might say that there's something psychologically different when a step-parent kills a child and when a genetic parent kills their child. At first, it might seem like Dolly and Wilson's findings are obvious, that anybody could have discovered that step-parents are the number one risk factor for child abuse. However, hundreds of studies on child abuse had been done prior to Dolly and Wilson's work, yet they all failed to recognize step-parents as the number one risk factor for child maltreatment until Dolly and Wilson approached the issue with an evolutionary perspective. So in conclusion, there are two important takeaways from this video. The first one is to recognize that an evolutionary theoretical perspective was pivotal in discovering why the Cinderella effect exists. In other words, an evolutionary approach was what led to the discovery of the Cinderella effect. The second takeaway from this video is that now that we understand why the Cinderella effect exists, measures to protect children at risk of child abuse need to be further implemented so that we can keep our children safe. Thanks.